1944, Northern Idaho Forest Camp, 0607. AM winter pressed against the pine-rimmed valley like a clenched fist. Frost clung to the barbed wire, turning every strand into a silver blade. The camp whistle shrieked, slicing through the cold, and German women shuffled out of the barracks, thin coats, trembling breath, boots stiff with ice. Kitchen steam drifted behind them, rising like ghosts over the tin roofs. In the guard tower, an American sentry rubbed his hands together, watching the line form below with sleepy discipline. It was roll call, nothing unusual, until it was. Sergeant Cole stepped forward with his clipboard, ready to bark the morning count, when 3 German women suddenly broke from the line. They fell to their knees in the snow, faces pale, hands shaking, eyes lowered. "Punish us, please," one whispered in halting English. The guards froze. Cole blinked, confused. Punish? For what? More women stepped forward, bowing their heads, begging for discipline, for confinement, for suffering they assume must come. None of the Americans spoke. They stared, caught between shock and an ache they didn't yet understand. Because the truth, the real reason these women thought they deserved punishment, would unravel everything the guards believed about the enemy, and everything the prisoners believed about themselves. The first women to arrive at the Idaho Forest Camp had no sense of where they were. Their transport train had crossed 4 states in 5 nights, rattling past endless pine trees and frozen plains that looked nothing like the Europe they had left behind. They were German auxiliaries, clerks, nurses, radio operators, swept up in the collapse of the Western Front and processed as prisoners of war along with thousands of men. Their capture was chaotic. Some had surrendered willingly, terrified of the rumors about Soviet retribution. Others had been marched for days through ruined villages before being herded into the holds of Liberty ships bound for the United States. Many had believed that crossing the ocean meant death. Instead, they found themselves staring at an America they never imagined existed. The United States built more than 500 POW camps across its vast interior, and the Idaho facility was one of the most isolated. Hidden among thick forests and mountain ridges, the camp had been chosen precisely because escape was almost impossible. The nearest town was nearly 20 miles away, the terrain unforgiving, and snowstorms unpredictable. The camp itself was modest, rows of long wooden barracks, a mess hall that smelled of boiled coffee, a medical hut, guard towers at each corner, and a fenced perimeter that glistened with frost most mornings. Despite its remote location, the camp followed Geneva Convention requirements meticulously. Prisoners received proper food, shelter, and protection. Yet for the women who arrived in early winter, none of this brought comfort. They had been conditioned for years to fear their captors. German propaganda had painted Americans as violent, undisciplined, and morally corrupt. Women, especially those in uniform, were warned that capture meant humiliation at best and brutality at worst. Many had been told, repeatedly, that Allied soldiers viewed female prisoners as spoils rather than combatants. Even the announcement that they would be sent to the United States felt like a prelude to something terrible. No one told them what camp life would actually be like. They spent the voyage huddled together in silence, imagining punishments, interrogations, starvation. They had been raised in a system where authority punished weakness, where errors were met with shouting or blows, where guilt, real or imagined, was corrected by harsh discipline. So, when they reached American soil and found no guards screaming at them, no one striking them, no threats, no cruelty, they became more frightened, not less. Mercy felt like a test. The trip inland was slow and disorienting. Military trucks moved them through wide-open landscapes where farms stretched farther than the horizon. They saw men and women dressed in thick coats and denim, carrying groceries, tending livestock, laughing in the cold air. None of them looked afraid. None seemed hungry. The contrast shattered something inside the prisoners. They had expected ruins and shortages. Instead, America seemed untouched by war, overflowing with food and heat and abundance. That abundance was its own shock. Some of the women whispered that perhaps the Americans treated prisoners well, only to break them later. Others insisted that this calm was a deception, a ritual before punishment. Their nerves were raw by the time the forest camp gates appeared through the snowfall. The guards assigned to the Idaho camp were young, some barely older than the women they watched over. Many had trained for frontline duty, but were diverted to POW service after injuries or because the Army needed reliable staff far from combat zones. They were taught that discipline must be strict but fair, no abuse, no retaliation, no threats. The United States wanted to avoid the cycle of brutality seen in Europe and the Pacific. The war was already heavy enough. The camps were to be governed by rules, not vengeance. Still, the guards were surprised to see the German women shrinking from them, avoiding eye contact, jumping at sudden noises, freezing whenever a command was issued. It created an awkward silence between captor and captive, a distance neither side knew how to bridge. The cultural gulf was enormous. Many Americans could not understand the rigid hierarchy the women had lived under, nor the fear that obedience was the only protection. In Germany, supervisors could punish harshly for small mistakes. Shame was a tool of discipline, and women serving in uniform were expected to demonstrate twice as much strength and silence. Any sign of fear was an invitation for reprimand. So, when the American sergeants gave calm instructions, the women listened for the hidden threat that never came. When they were handed full meals, beans, potatoes, meat, they waited for someone to snatch them away. When guards opened doors for them to walk through, they hesitated, suspecting a trap. Nothing about this new world aligned with the one they had been shaped by. The journey from Europe to the forest camp broke their sense of time. Days blurred into nights on the train. Snowfall replaced the damp cold of the Rhine. The hum of American engines replaced the distant thunder of artillery. They arrived exhausted, convinced of their own guilt simply because they were prisoners. They believed punishment was inevitable, even necessary. They believed suffering was the only currency they had left to pay. That is why, on that freezing morning during roll call, when the routine seemed too quiet, too merciful, too clean, several of them stepped forward and offered themselves for punishment. Because in their minds, kindness was impossible. And when kindness feels impossible, punishment feels familiar. The snow kept falling during their first week in the Idaho forest camp, dusting the barracks roofs and settling on the ridgelines like a soft white weight. Inside the women's quarters, bunk beds creaked under thin blankets, the potbelly stove working unevenly against the bitter cold. They tried to keep order, folding uniforms, sweeping the wooden floor, organizing belongings in neat rows, but each action was haunted by a certainty that the Americans were waiting for a mistake. Back home, discipline was enforced with fear. A misfiled report, a wrong step in formation, a misplaced medical instrument, any of it could earn a reprimand or humiliation. So, when the Americans remained calm, patient, almost indifferent, the women grew tense. Fear of punishment became fear of not being punished. The Army's rules were rigid in a different way. Guards were instructed to maintain distance, avoid unnecessary physical contact, and limit personal conversation. It wasn't cruelty. It was procedure. But to the women, this distance signaled something ominous. If Americans didn't shout and didn't strike, then perhaps they were simply waiting for the right moment to start. Kindness, in their world, had always been a mask. Even the simple quiet of the camp unnerved them. No bombings, no air raid sirens, no trembling buildings. Only the wind pushing through pine branches like a long, slow exhale. At night, they lay awake listening for footsteps outside the barracks, expecting the door to burst open. No one came. Guards walked past every hour, boots crunching softly on the snow. Some carried thermoses of coffee. Occasionally, one would hum to himself to stay awake, a sound so casual and unafraid that the women did not know how to interpret it. In Germany, a guard humming on night duty would have been disciplined. Here, it sounded like a reminder that the world beyond, war existed, something warm, domestic, almost peaceful. It felt like another trick. Their arrival had caused confusion among the American staff. Female prisoners of war were rare, and most camps were built for men. Africa Corps troops, U-boat crews, infantry from the Western Front. The women's barracks needed new privacy measures, new schedules, new protocols. The guards were briefed repeatedly. No contact beyond duty, respect boundaries, avoid improvised authority. The Army feared scandal more than anything. Newspapers back home already printed enough stories, so the Americans operated with stiff formality, trying not to offend, while the women interpreted every neutral gesture as something dangerous. The cultural chasm widened without a single word spoken. When the camp physician arrived for intake examinations, the tension deepened. He was middle-aged, impatient, overwhelmed. The army doctor saw the women as a checklist: weight, temperature, rations, lice inspection, frostbite assessment. To him, this was routine medical work. To the women, the demand to remove boots or open collars felt like humiliation. They braced for shame. Instead, he wrote notes, muttered about malnutrition, and ordered extra bread for the barracks. This act, so mundane to Americans, sent panic rippling through the group. Extra bread? That must mean punishment was coming. Why else would the enemy feed them? The guards saw the unease but misunderstood it. They thought the women were afraid of the cold, or the isolation, or the idea of being in a foreign country. None of them recognized the deeper truth. The prisoners had brought years of ideological conditioning with them. They had lived in a system where guilt was cultivated like a garden, where loyalty was proven by endurance and suffering. Many of the women had served under officers who believed strictness was a virtue, who repeated endlessly that the enemy was savage, dishonorable, incapable of humanity. Now, confronted with an enemy who enforced rules but not cruelty, they felt the ground slide out from beneath them. The journey that delivered them to this bewildering reality lingered in their minds. They remembered the cold warehouses where they waited for transport, guarded by Wehrmacht soldiers who called them cowards for surrendering. They remembered the ship crossing, seasick nights in a dark hold, praying that American aircraft would not mistake them for a combat vessel. They remembered the moment they stepped onto American soil, expecting jeering crowds, only to find bored logistics officers who barely looked at them. Everything contradicted the warnings they had lived under. But it was the long train ride north that unsettled them most. Through frost-coated windows, they saw landscapes that felt impossibly vast, ranches larger than towns, forests that stretched longer than the Rhine Valley, factories pouring out steam and light even in winter. At small stations, they glimpsed American families laughing. Together, children running through snow with mittens and scarves, women holding grocery bags overflowing with food. Not ration cards, not shortages, not fear. Life in America moved forward untouched by the war's devastation. This sight, normalcy, abundance, tormented the prisoners more than hunger or cold ever had. They felt small, defeated, emotionally stripped. If their enemy lived like this, if this was the nation they had been told was weak, corrupt, and dying, then what did that say about everything they had believed? By the time they arrived at the forest camp, they were hollow with contradictions. They carried invisible burdens, loyalty to a collapsing homeland, guilt for surviving while others died, shame for being captured, and fear that everything they had been taught about the enemy might be wrong. They were prepared to be threatened. They were not prepared to be ignored, respected, or fed. So every morning they waited for punishment. Every night they whispered about when it would begin. And when it didn't, the uncertainty became unbearable. That was the psychological landscape that led to the moment when several women stepped out of formation during roll call and begged the Americans to discipline them. Not because they had done anything wrong, but because they believed justice demanded suffering. They believed being prisoners made them unworthy. And they believed the American silence must be hiding something far worse. The first shock came in the mess hall. Food, real food, steaming, seasoned, abundant. The women entered cautiously, expecting bowls of thin soup, hard crusts of bread, or rations barely fit for livestock. Instead, they smelled potatoes cooked with butter, thick slices of bread still warm from the camp ovens, beans simmering with onions, and sometimes, unthinkably, meat. Not sausage scraps or diluted broth, but generous portions. Some prisoners stared at their trays in silence, afraid to touch the food. Others began to shake, overwhelmed. One woman whispered that this must be a mistake. Someone would take it away. Another refused to eat it first, convinced it was a trick to soften them before punishment. Guards, confused, repeated the rule. Everyone eats, no exceptions. A few prisoners cried quietly over their trays, hiding their faces. Not because of hunger, but because of humiliation. Their families in Germany were starving, their towns were rubble, and here they were, enemies, being fed better by Americans than their own people. The shame was crushing. One woman later wrote in her diary that each bite tasted like betrayal, Yet slowly, day by day, they ate. The Americans checked weights weekly, adding extra portions to anyone who was underweight. This act of care, meant as procedure, felt like a blow to the women's sense of identity. They were prisoners. Why were their captors protecting their health? Clothing and hygiene created a second, quieter shock. The camp laundry issued clean undergarments and thick socks, far better than anything they had received during the final months of the war. Hot showers were scheduled twice a week. In Germany, fuel shortages had made such luxury impossible. Some women hesitated to undress, expecting roughness or prying eyes. Instead, American female staff supervised, speaking softly and never touching unless necessary. The women lathered themselves in warm water, watching steam rise like something unreal. One stared at her reflection in the fogged mirror, unable to reconcile the face of a defeated auxiliary with the comfort surrounding her. Cleanliness had been a forgotten privilege. Here, it was routine. Camp hygiene rules were strict but impersonal. Wash hands before meals, maintain bunks, rotate chores. There were no punishments beyond extra duty. No screaming supervisors, no unpredictable outbursts. It left the women unmoored. Structure without violence felt unnatural. When one woman accidentally broke a ceramic plate, she froze, waiting for a blow. The American cook simply shrugged, swept up the pieces, and handed her another. She shook for hours afterward, unable to understand why mercy felt more frightening than anger. Despite the isolation of the forest, humanity seeped in through unexpected places. Civilians from nearby farms occasionally interacted with the camp, especially during supply deliveries. A ranch couple once donated fresh eggs, explaining they had more hens than sense. The women stared at them, stunned by the casual generosity. Civilians were supposed to hate them, yet the rancher's wife offered a shy smile, as though embarrassed by her own kindness. The women whispered about her for days, trying to understand whether Americans were pretending or whether they had been misled their entire lives. Learning English became both a necessity and a revelation. At first, the women used simple phrases: yes, no, thank you. Guards noticed their efforts and slowed their speech, pointing to objects with patience none of the prisoners expected. One guard, Private Lewis, occasionally left a chalkboard outside the barracks with new vocabulary words: snow, bread, tree, warm. He never explained why he did it. He simply wrote the words each morning and erased them each night. The women waited until the yard was clear before approaching the board in small groups, tracing the letters with their fingers like forbidden knowledge. Language, once a dividing wall, became a fragile bridge. Some evenings, the sky over the camp turned violet as the sun slipped behind the ridge. In those hours, humor appeared, softening the edges of fear. One prisoner, a former typist, imitated the dramatic tone of a German propagandist describing American incompetence, while gesturing at the steaming dinner pots behind her. The entire barracks erupted into muffled laughter. Another woman joked that the guard tower resembled a lonely Christmas tree draped in snow and light. Small moments, fleeting but powerful. They reminded the prisoners that they were still human, capable of laughter despite everything. Yet beneath these gentle shifts was a current of trauma. The women wrestled with guilt for having survived, for having surrendered, for being treated better by their captors than by their own leadership. Some carried memories of harsh officers, betrayals within their units, or punishments delivered without reason. Healing was slow, delicate, and often painful. At night, the barracks echoed with quiet sobbing, the kind that comes when fear dissolves and something heavier rises to take its place. One evening, an American medic entered the infirmary to check on a sick prisoner. She recoiled at first, thinking he might reprimand her for weakness. Instead, he placed a blanket around her shoulders and said, "Cold travels faster than fever up here." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. For the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to breathe without bracing for impact. By the end of their second month in the Idaho camp, the women were living in a fragile balance, caught between an ideology that demanded suffering and a reality that offered dignity. They did not trust it. They did not know how. And yet it was happening, piece by piece, as constant as snowfall and as quiet as forgiveness. The second wave of human experiences unfolded not in the mess hall or the barracks, but in the tasks the prisoners were eventually assigned. The Idaho forest camp wasn't built for hard labor. Instead, it relied on routine maintenance work, shoveling snow from walkways, sorting firewood, repairing fences. To the American guards, this was mild, necessary, almost mundane. But to the German women, these tasks carried emotional weight. They had expected forced labor, backbreaking work under threat of violence. Instead, they were given manageable duties, supervised at a respectful distance, and allowed to rest when tired. The first day, the women shoveled snow anxiously, waiting for commands, flinching when a guard approached. But no one yelled. No one inspected the piles with contempt. The Americans simply checked the progress with a nod and moved on. This confused the prisoners more than cruelty ever would. Work without humiliation felt unnatural, even suspicious. Farm assignments were the greatest surprise. Some women were taken outside the camp, under guard, to assist with winter chores on nearby homesteads. They had imagined angry civilians, resentment, perhaps even danger. Instead, they met families who treated them with polite caution, not hostility. On one farm, a wiry rancher handed a German prisoner a pair of leather gloves and said, "You'll freeze your fingers off without these." She stared at the gloves as if they were artifacts from another world. During lunch breaks, the farm families offered sandwiches, apples, and hot coffee. The women accepted awkwardly, ashamed, grateful, and deeply unsettled. Kindness from civilians felt like a violation of the narrative they had been raised on. It suggested that the world was larger and more complicated than ideology. And then came an unexpected form of connection, the rhythm of shared work. One woman, Anna, helped mend a barn fence beside a rancher's teenage daughter. They didn't speak the same language, but both laughed when the hammer slipped and the nail flew into the snow. Humor didn't require translation. That afternoon left Anna shaken. It was the first time since her capture she had felt like a person rather than a prisoner. That frightened her more than anything. Inside the camp, English lessons started informally. Guards never taught officially, but acts of curiosity blurred the lines. A young private named Morgan would tap the fence post during inspection and say, "Fence." Tap his boot. Boot. Point at the sky. Cloud. The women repeated the words quietly, memorizing sounds like secret codes. Soon the barracks buzzed with whispered English phrases after lights out. Learning the language didn't feel like fraternizing. It felt like survival, like reclaiming some control over their lives. But it also created an emotional conflict. Every new word made America less foreign, less monstrous, less enemy. Friendship within the group was complicated, shaped by shared fear and lingering loyalties. Some prisoners clung fiercely to their training, insisting that everything they saw was manipulation. Others, especially the younger women, allowed moments of softness to enter. Whispered jokes in the snow, shared warmth around the barrack stove, memories of civilian life before the war. They stitched themselves together with small comforts. Even so, guilt lingered heavily. Laughter felt like betrayal, relaxing felt like forgetting, and forgetting felt dangerous. Healing began in layers too thin to notice at first. A woman who arrived trembling at every guard's presence found herself walking past them without flinching. Another, who refused to eat more than half her meal, eventually finished everything on her tray. Some began brushing their hair with care again, tying it neatly, reclaiming dignity piece by piece. Yet the trauma did not disappear. It lived in the way they jolted awake during storms, in the silence that fell whenever planes flew overhead, in the way they lined up too quickly when called, terrified of making a mistake. One afternoon brought a moment that revealed just how deep the contradictions ran. A guard slipped on ice while carrying firewood, scattering logs across the snow. For a heartbeat, the prisoners froze, expecting someone to be punished. But then another guard burst into laughter and bent to help him. The women exchanged looks of disbelief. In their world, mistakes from leadership resulted in anger, not amusement. The idea that authority could laugh at its own clumsiness felt impossible. These experiences, small and scattered, accumulated into something neither guards nor prisoners fully understood yet. The women were shedding layers of fear they had carried across oceans and through years of indoctrination. But they didn't know who they were without that fear. They didn't know what to trust. They didn't know how to accept gentleness without expecting its reversal. And so, their internal world grew heavier, just as their external world grew safer. This tension, the collision between fear and compassion, punishment and dignity, indoctrination and reality, was the quiet storm building inside the camp. A storm that would break during the moment no one expected, the moment that changed everything the American guards believed about their prisoners, and everything the German women believed about themselves. It happened on a morning that looked like every other, cold, pale, and quiet enough to hear the distant crack of ice forming along the river. Snow clung to the pine branches like thick wool. Inside the camp, breakfast trays clattered, doors swung open, and boots tapped across frozen ground. Nothing suggested that anything extraordinary was coming. Yet beneath that ordinary winter sky, the emotional fault lines inside the camp were about to rupture. Sergeant Cole walked his usual inspection route with 2 guards at his side. He liked the early hours, the silence, the clarity, and he often imagined how different things would look if the women weren't prisoners, if this were just a small mountain town and everyone had chosen to be here. But reality always tugged him back. The fences, the watchtower, the war raging thousands of miles away. As he approached the center yard, he saw the prisoners already forming their roll call lines. He expected stiff posture, lowered eyes, quiet fear. Instead, he saw movement, hesitant, trembling movement, as several women stepped out of formation. At first he thought it was confusion, then he saw their faces. They weren't confused, they were terrified. 3 women sank to their knees in the snow, hands clasped, heads bowed like supplicants. Their breaths came in sharp clouds. Others shifted behind them, whispering urgently in German. Cole stopped mid-step, unsure whether he was witnessing rebellion or something stranger. Before he could speak, one of the kneeling women lifted her face. Her cheeks were streaked with tears that froze before they fully formed. "Punish us," she said, in halting English. "Please, punish us for yesterday." Yesterday? Cole searched his memory. Yesterday had been uneventful. They'd been shoveling snow on the south path. One woman had slipped on the icy hill and nearly twisted her ankle. A guard had helped her up. That was all. No violation, no rule broken, nothing that warranted punishment. His silence only frightened them further. Another woman pressed her forehead into the snow. "We worked slowly. We disrespected American order. We deserved discipline." The other prisoners began, trembling as though the kneeling women had voiced a fear they all shared. A few nodded, eyes wide with dread. The oldest woman in the group whispered, "You must punish us, or something worse will come." Cole's stomach tightened. Something worse. What did they think would happen? Why were they begging for pain in a place where no one intended to hurt them? He knelt down slowly, trying not to tower over them. "Stand up," he said gently. "No one is punishing you." The reaction was immediate. Panic, confusion, disbelief. One woman shook her head violently, as though rejecting the reality in front of her. Another looked to the guards as if waiting for the real punishment to begin. This was more than fear. This was conditioning. The women weren't afraid of the Americans. They were afraid of not being punished. Cole motioned for the camp translator, a young corporal who knew only rough German, but enough to help. When he arrived, Cole spoke quietly. "Ask them why they think they deserve punishment." The corporal translated. The yard fell silent. The women answered all at once, voices trembling, overlapping, pleading. They said discipline protected them. They said punishment meant order. They said if the Americans didn't correct them, it meant something worse was coming. They said German officers had always punished them for small errors, so mercy felt like deception. They said kindness couldn't be trusted. They said survival depended on obedience, and obedience was proven through suffering. Cole felt the words like blows. The guards exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror. These women weren't asking for leniency or forgiveness. They were asking for pain because they believed pain was safety. They believed a world without punishment was a world that would collapse beneath them. But then something happened that no one expected. A young German woman at the end of the line stepped forward, shaking violently. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "In Germany, if no punishment came, it meant someone was planning something worse, something final." The yard froze. Now the truth exposed itself, raw and unmistakable. These women didn't fear the Americans' cruelty. They feared their silence. They feared the unknown. They feared a system that treated them better than their own had. They feared discovering they had been lied to their entire lives. And then, as if pushed by invisible force, another woman burst into tears. Not the soft, contained crying the guards sometimes heard at night, but a breaking, heaving cry that carried across the yard. She covered her face, overwhelmed by the collapse of everything she had believed about the enemy. Cole stood still, feeling his throat tighten. He had prepared for escape attempts, for defiance, for despair. He had never prepared for a moment when prisoners begged for punishment because mercy felt intolerable. His men looked to him for direction. He understood laws and contracts better than the white lawyers in Denver. That's how he got the land. The previous owner died owing taxes, and Papa found the legal notice before anyone else. He paid the fees and filed the claim. A smart man, Thorne mused. Dangerous thing to be in a town like this. Too smart, Ilara whispered. He started getting sick last winter. It began with tremors in his hands, then confusion. He started seeing things. Dr. Finnegan, Sterling's cousin, said it was mountain fever and prescribed tonics. Papa only got worse. By the end, he didn't even know me. Thorne's face darkened. That doesn't sound like fever. No, it doesn't. Ilara reached into her satchel and produced a small glass vial wrapped in a cloth. I found this hidden in the back of Papa's medicine chest after the funeral. I sent a sample to a chemist in San Francisco. It's mercury. Given in small doses over time, it drives a man mad before it kills him. Thorne took the vial, holding it up to the shaft of light filtering through the stained glass. Proof of murder. Proof enough for me, Ilara said fiercely, but not enough for a court that takes a white doctor's word over a black woman's. But if I keep the land, I keep the evidence. I keep fighting. There are others Sterling has crushed. If we stand, they might stand with us. Thorne handed the vial back. You are trusting a stranger with a lot of dangerous secrets, Ilara. My father used to say, desperation clarifies the mind. She met his gaze. Besides, I lied earlier. I know more about you. You're Caleb Thorne, the man who held off the Red River Gang in Abilene. You're the one who negotiated the peace between the sheep herders and the cattle barons in Wyoming without firing a shot. You solve problems, Mr. Thorne. I am offering you the chance to solve mine. Thorne leaned back, the wood creaking. Those stories get taller every time they're told. I'm just a man who prefers words to bullets when I can help it. Then talk to me. Why accept? It's a risk. For the first time, a shadow of personal pain crossed Thorne's face. My own father lost his farm to a railroad lawyer and a crooked sheriff. I was a boy, too young to do anything but watch him break. Maybe I'm just tired of watching. He stood up, extending a hand. Let's find Reverend Jacobs. We best get this done before Sterling figures out how to stop the clock. The ceremony was hasty, performed by a bewildered Reverend Jacobs with Mrs. Liu, the Chinese laundress, and Old Man Silas, a crippled prospector, serving as witnesses. As they spoke the vows, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting Silver Creek in shades of blood and bruised purple. I do, Thorne said, his voice steady as a rock slide. I do, Ilara echoed, surprising herself with the strength of her own voice. When they emerged from the church, night had fully fallen, but the darkness wasn't empty. Standing at the bottom of the steps was barracks. The stove struggled to stay lit. Blankets weren't enough. The cold seeped through every gap in the walls, stiffening fingers and numbing feet. Some women huddled together, teeth chattering. A few cried quietly, not from fear of punishment now, but from the memory of colder nights during the last years of the war, nights when no one came to check on them. Near midnight, the barracks door opened with a violent gust of wind. Sergeant Cole stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. He counted quickly, then realized they were missing someone. Anna. She had been working at a farm earlier that afternoon, helping stack wood. She was supposed to return before dusk, but the storm hit suddenly. No one had noticed she was missing until now. The German prisoners surged into panic, not because a guard might blame them, but because someone from their own group was out there, alone, freezing, with miles of forest between her and safety. Old instincts tore back to the surface. Protect your own. But they had no power to act. They were prisoners. Cole read their faces, fear, desperation, not for themselves, but for Anna. Stay inside, he said calmly. I'll find her. The women stared at him in disbelief. Guards risked their lives for prisoners only in stories, never in reality. Cole didn't wait for a reaction. He barked orders to his men and stepped back into the storm. The rope line was nearly useless. Visibility dropped to arm's length. Snow clawed at their faces like icy fingers. The wind roared between the trees, carrying the sharp scent of pine and danger. The guards called Anna's name, but the storm swallowed every sound. Minutes stretched into an hour, and then another. Inside the barracks, the prisoners huddled by the windows, listening for footsteps outside. One woman, Lauda, held her hands together tightly, murmuring a prayer she hadn't spoken since she was a child. Another stared at the door, as though willing it to open. Someone whispered, "Americans do not search this long for prisoners. No army does." Someone else answered softly, "Maybe we were taught wrong." Near dawn, just as exhaustion began to settle in, voices erupted outside. Boots crunched heavily toward the barracks. The women rose as one, hearts thundering in their chests. Cole entered first, covered in frost, supporting Anna on his shoulder. Her face was pale, her hair stiff with ice, her gloves frozen to her hands. She had collapsed in the snow less than a mile from camp, disoriented and unable to walk. Cole had carried her the rest of the way. He laid her gently on a bunk, wrapping her in blankets. An American medic rushed in behind him, checking her pulse and rubbing warmth into her arms. Someone brought hot water. Someone else lit the stove higher. The German women watched silently. Then something broke open inside them. A sound rose from their ranks, soft at first, then louder. Not sobbing this time, not fear. It was gratitude. Deep, painful, overwhelming gratitude. Anna reached weakly for Cole's sleeve. "Why?" she whispered through cracked lips. "Why help me? I am the enemy." Cole looked stunned by the question. "Not tonight," he said simply. "Tonight you were just someone who needed help." The words hit the women harder than any lecture on democracy or humanity ever could. No ideology had prepared them for this moment. No propaganda had warned them that enemies could choose compassion without expecting allegiance. Several women began to cry, not the sharp defensive crying of fear, but the heavy release of people realizing the world was not as cruel as they had been taught. One whispered, "Then everything we believed was wrong." Another said, "If they see us as human, what does that make them?" But the most profound shift came from a woman who had said almost nothing since arriving at the camp. She stepped forward, eyes shining, and spoke in German to the others. "If the enemy treats us like this, then what were we fighting for?" No one answered. The question hung in the air like the breath of a new truth, terrifying, warm, undeniable. When the storm finally cleared, the camp looked the same. But inside, something irreversible had happened. When spring finally began to loosen winter's grip on the Idaho mountains, the snow melted into long, shining rivers, and the forest breathed again. The camp changed with the seasons, mud replacing ice, pine needles softening footpaths, sunlight warming the barracks' roofs. But the deeper transformation was within the prisoners themselves. The women no longer walked with rigid shoulders or lowered eyes. They no longer braced at every command. Something in them had settled, not into comfort, but into clarity. Repatriation rumors spread slowly at first. Whispers carried from guard to prisoner, from prisoner to barracks, from barracks to the small heart of hope inside each woman. No one knew when the war would end, or how quickly the captured auxiliaries would be processed afterward. Some feared being sent back to Germany too soon, before learning whether their families survived. Others feared staying too long and returning home as strangers in a defeated land. Either way, the days of confinement no longer felt like a sentence. They felt like a pause, a strange, unlikely reprieve carved out of war. American officials began compiling lists for transfer. The women were fingerprinted, photographed, interviewed again. Camp clerks explained the process in simple English, with gestures and patience. Many of the prisoners wrote to the Red Cross for the first time, their handwriting trembling on the page, unsure whether the letters would reach Europe, unsure whether anyone was left to read them. One woman asked a guard how to spell the word alive. Another asked how to say "I am safe" properly. She practiced it under her breath until she could write it without hesitation. The camp's final. Months took on a strange atmosphere, half farewell, half awakening. Some guards who had once kept emotional distance now found themselves lingering in conversation, even if limited by language. One guard, Private Morgan, brought old magazines from home and left them on a bench near the canteen. The women flipped through them carefully, marveling at smiling American families, advertisements for products they had never seen, recipes that felt like fiction. On one page was a photograph of a living room, soft chairs, a warm lamp, a family gathered around a radio. A prisoner traced the lamp with her fingertip and whispered, "We had something like this before everything broke." The American staff began to understand that the women were leaving with two parallel truths. The Germany they remembered was gone, and the America they had feared was not what they had been taught. Those truths clashed inside them, creating an emotional tension that no order or procedure could resolve. Before departure, each prisoner was allowed her diary back, if she had kept one. Many had written secretly during transport or early captivity, fearing discovery. Now, those diaries became lifelines. They chronicled hunger, confusion, humiliation, but also the moments that altered their worldview, the warm gloves from a rancher, the English words scribbled in chalk, the laughter around the barrack stove, the night the guards searched for Anna in the storm. One diary contained a single line repeated 27 times. If they were monsters, why didn't they ever act like monsters? Another contained a sketch of the Idaho mountains with the caption, "I feared this place. Now I fear leaving it." Some entries were full of guilt. Guilt for surviving, guilt for adapting, guilt for feeling warmth in a country they were taught to despise. Others were filled with questions. What awaited them in Germany? Would they be welcomed or judged? Would anyone believe what they had experienced? Could a life shaped by fear ever be reshaped by kindness? One prisoner wrote a letter to her mother that became something of legend among the group. She read parts of it aloud one evening as the sun lowered over the forest. "They do not beat us here. They do not shame us. They do not starve us. They say we have worth even when we think we do not. I do not know who I will be when I return home, but I know who I am not anymore." Her voice trembled. The others listened in silence, the words settling into them like seeds waiting for soil. As departure day approached, the camp took on an almost surreal gentleness. Guards helped load small luggage sacks. The women straightened their uniforms, not out of fear, but out of a desire to look like themselves again. The barbed wire no longer seemed symbolic of captivity. It had become a strange boundary between the world they came from and the world they were about to re-enter. On the morning of transport, the women lined up one last time, this time on their own terms. No trembling, no expectation of punishment, just a quiet, heavy understanding that they were leaving a place that had dismantled their beliefs and rebuilt their sense of self. As the trucks approached, a guard stepped forward holding a folded scarf. It belonged to Anna, the woman rescued during the blizzard. She had repaired it carefully, stitching the torn seam with thread from the camp sewing kit. She held it out to Cole with both hands. "For you," she said. "So, you remember we were here. So, we remember too." Cole hesitated, then accepted it with a nod that meant more than words could carry. When the trucks rolled out of the gate, the prisoners turned to look back, not because they mourned captivity, but because a chapter of their lives had ended in a way none of them could have predicted. They had walked into the forest camp as enemies. They were leaving as human beings who had been seen clearly for the first time. The return journey began with the same rattling motion that had once filled them with dread. The heavy clank of train couplings, the groan of steel wheels turning, the sway of wooden benches beneath their weight. But this time, the fear was different. It wasn't terror of what the Americans might do. It was terror of what awaited them in the place they still called home. Germany, what was left of it, was not the land they remembered. Rumors had filtered even into the camp. Cities burned flat, rail lines twisted, mothers queuing for bread that never came, children searching rubble for firewood. Every woman on the train wondered whether the people they loved had survived the bombing, the hunger, the chaos, whether their own homes still existed, whether returning would mean stepping into an embrace or into ruins. As the train moved east across the United States, the women pressed their faces to the windows, watching a world they were beginning to understand slip past them. Green fields replaced forests, warm breezes replaced icy winds. Small towns appeared with white porches and children riding bicycles along dirt roads. It looked like a country untouched by the war's scars, a country whose abundance and calm still unsettled them. Some whispered that they would never forget this sight, not because it was beautiful, but because it contradicted everything they had been raised to believe. In their diaries, they wrote about America with a complexity they couldn't have imagined months earlier. One woman wrote, "We were told they were brutes. They treated us better than our own officers ever did." Another wrote, "It is strange to trust someone you were taught to hate. Stranger still when they never demanded your trust at all." As they crossed the Atlantic, many of the women clutched their diaries to their chests, terrified they would be confiscated. Not because they contained secrets, but because those diaries were proof of kindness, proof of contradictions, proof that the world was larger and gentler than the one they had been raised in. When the ships neared Europe, the mood shifted. The coastline appeared through fog, gray, wounded, familiar, and foreign all at once. Their throats tightened. Home was a word with different meanings now: belonging, memory, guilt, fear. Some had not heard from families since 1944. Others knew they were returning to broken streets, ration cards, and a defeated nation grappling with truths too heavy to bear. Upon disembarkation, military officials processed them quickly. They were still uniformed, still technically soldiers, still accountable to German authorities now under Allied supervision. Civilians passed by, some staring, some looking away. Only a handful offered nods or whispered wishes of luck. The women moved in small clusters, holding one another's sleeves like children. Reunions were chaotic, emotional, unpredictable. One woman found her mother alive, standing beside a neighbor in a makeshift reception station. They ran into each other's arms, but cried not from relief alone, also from the shock of how thin they'd become, how much war had taken. Another woman searched 3 lists before finally accepting that her home had been destroyed in a bombing raid months earlier. She had no address to return to, no family to find. She folded her diary against her chest like a heartbeat, the only constant she had left. Many faced something even heavier: disbelief. When they told their families how the Americans treated them, how they were fed, housed, warmed, protected, some relatives frowned, uneasy. Others said, "It cannot be. They are the enemy." A few accused the women of forgetting their homeland too easily, of becoming soft, of being deceived by American kindness. But the women knew what they had lived. They had felt hands lifting them from snow, seen guards risk their lives to find a missing prisoner, tasted food that felt like mercy, and witnessed an enemy refuse to punish them, even when they begged for it. In time, their stories spread slowly, softly, like threads weaving into the larger fabric of a nation, trying to understand its past. Some former prisoners spoke openly about their experience. Others wrote memoirs or letters published years later. Still others kept silent, afraid their kindness-filled memories would brand them as traitors. Yet many of them carried a quiet truth that shaped the rest of their lives. They had been treated as human beings by the very people they were taught to fear. One woman, interviewed decades later, said, "The Americans broke something in us, not with force, with gentleness. It was the first time in my life I learned that authority does not need to strike to be strong." Another said, "When I die, bury me with the scarf Anna gave that sergeant. That winter in Idaho taught me that enemies are often just strangers whose language you never learned." But perhaps the most profound reflection came from a woman who had never spoken publicly before. She wrote in her final letter, "I left Germany as a soldier. I returned as something else, someone who understood that mercy is not weakness and suffering is not duty. America did not free my body. It freed my mind." The years passed, yet the memory of that forest camp remained suspended in the minds of the women who had lived through it, quietly, persistently, like a distant lantern that refused to go out. As the world rebuilt itself, as borders shifted, as new governments rose and old loyalties crumbled, each woman carried within her a small, unspoken truth. Humanity can survive even inside the machinery of war. They remembered the cold first, the kind that stiffened breath and numbed fingers, but also the warmth that followed, rising not from stoves or blankets, but from the simplest impossible gestures. A guard searching the woods at night for a prisoner, a rancher offering gloves, a medic placing a blanket on trembling shoulders, a sergeant accepting a mended scarf as if it were a medal. These were not grand acts history books record. They were quiet choices, made when no one was watching, and they became the lifelines by which the women rediscovered themselves. Looking back, they realized the fences had not confined them as much as their own beliefs had. Barbed wire could keep bodies in place, but it was fear, taught, repeated, expected, that kept their minds chained to a world where mercy felt like danger and dignity felt undeserved. When the Americans refused to punish them, something fundamental cracked. When they offered help without demand, something long buried began to stir. Years later, in letters to their children or in memories shared across kitchen tables, the women tried to explain it. They described the sound of snow under boots, the distant whistle at dawn, the way pine trees looked under moonlight. They described the confusion of discovering kindness where they had braced for cruelty. They struggled to put into words the sensation of identity dissolving and reforming, shaped not by ideology, but by the quiet recognition of shared humanity. And in their reflections was a lesson larger than any war. Enemies are often made, not born, and sometimes it takes captivity to understand what freedom truly is. For some, the forest camp became a symbol of loss, of the world that had collapsed behind them. For others, it became a symbol of rebirth, of a future built on truths stronger than propaganda. But for all of them, it became the moment where fear loosened its grip, and something fragile but enduring took its place. When they spoke of it in old age, their voices softened, as though the memory were still unfolding in the snow. They thought they needed punishment to be safe, one woman said. But safety came from the hands that lifted us, not the ones that struck us. And another added, with a trembling smile, in a camp far from home, the people we were taught to hate taught us how to be human again.